Professor Yael Grushka-Cockayne, she's from the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. She's our guest in this month's Innovators Series webcast. Today she's going to share her research on optimism bias in portfolio and project planning, and she'll also share some of the key best practices for how to recognize it and how to avoid it in your portfolio planning. So it'll be a great discussion. We're going to target 45 minutes for this call, including time for questions. And at any time during this call, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat feature on WebEx that you all seem to be very familiar with by letting us know we don't have audio. So I think you'll recognize the chat feature. Go ahead and use that to send your questions, and we'll address those towards the end of today's call. For some context, let me tell you a little bit about Decision Lens. In one sentence, we are the premier solution for strategic portfolio prioritization and resource allocation. Our R&D and capital asset solutions are the underpinnings of many of the companies you see here on your screen. Pharmaceutical, CPG, defense, and tech organizations, they use our solution to really empower themselves to prioritize their investments in programs, in projects, technologies that really align to and support their overarching strategic goals. They use analytics and visualizations to really get the insight they need to optimally fund, schedule, and execute the investment so that they really can get a great return on investment from their limited budgets. This slide here really talks about why strategic prioritization is important. And looking at the titles of those of you who have joined the call today, I recognize I'm really preaching to the choir. This graphic here is an excerpt from one of our most popular white papers on strategic portfolio planning. It highlights some of the pitfalls in portfolio planning, specifically when you don't have a strategic framework for guiding your investments. So over on the left there, you may recognize that common challenge of scrambling to close a revenue gap or productivity gap or a need for new innovation within your organization. Without strategic prioritization, this effort can be a very short-sighted reactionary scramble. It can lead to missed opportunities, wasted resources on investments that ultimately fail, and unfortunately exacerbating a problem, the very problem you were trying to solve in the first place. On the right-hand side, with a strategic, analytical approach to portfolio planning, you really ensure that you're meeting both your short-term and your future needs, and that you really save your precious resources for only the investments that maximize your ROI. Now, when you do this, you provide the success you need to create a very rich pipeline to continue innovating and continue bringing new streams of revenue within your organization. So I can tell you at the end of the call where you can get the full paper to learn more about strategic prioritization. But in the meantime, I wanted to switch down to more information about our speaker. In the spirit of providing you the best in thought leadership in portfolio strategy and portfolio planning, we invited Professor Cockayne of the Darden School to join us today. I'll do no justice to her bio, but I'll tell you a little bit about her. Yael is an assistant professor of business administration at the Darden School of Business. Her education includes a bachelor's in industrial engineering, a master's degree in operational research from the London School of Economics, and master's degrees and PhD in management science and operations from the London Business School. So we're very, very happy to have her here. Her research and her teaching activities focus on decision analysis, forecasting, project management, and behavioral decision making. She's published in many academic and professional journals, including management science and operations research. And she's really uses her expertise to serve as a consultant to several international firms, especially in the aerospace and transportation industries. Finally, she's affiliated with the Informed Decision Analysis Society, the Project Management Institute, and she's a UVA Excellence in Diversity Fellow. So we really are looking forward to hearing from her on her research, and I think that you guys will find a lot of value in this. Professor, if you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and pass control over to you. Give me 1 second while I do that.
Cheers, I'm as ready as I can be.
All right. Okay, I'll pass that over to you.
Great. Let's see how seamlessly I do this.
I do see your slide up.
And I should be on the exact same slide that you left over.
Exactly.
Great. We did not fall subject to the planning fallacy yet so far. Thank you very much, Tirsa. Thank you for Decision Lens for hosting and for inviting me to participate and talk about my research. As an assistant professor, I get a lot of time in the classroom. I do a lot of consulting. I listen to companies and to managers talk about their problems. And I get some chance to talk about my research, but it's always fun to pitch it to a broader audience and to a group of practitioners as the list suggests that are on this call, and hopefully segments of what I talk about resonates with you all. As Tirsa said, my background is in industrial engineering. My focus is theoretical in the sense that when I talk about forecasting, I talk about aggregating forecasts. I explore these problems from a theoretical perspective. In a statistical perspective, what can I do with a theoretical model here in my office? But I very much am passionate and care about the application of these ideas. And that's why I've always enjoyed working in the project planning and project management domains, because it's a very much an applied context. There would be nothing for me to research if it weren't for actual projects and actual data coming from companies. And so this project that I will tell you about is really bringing together everything that I've known and learned about forecasting, everything that I've learned about project management at firms and portfolio management at firms, and even some characteristics that I've studied on how individuals make quick decisions or even heuristic decisions, and bringing it together to the context of an organization trying to perfect the way that they manage and plan their portfolio of projects. And so what we're going to talk about broadly today, assuming time permits for all of it, is really, generally speaking, what do we know about project performance and what factors contribute to what we will define as the planning fallacy, or what has been defined, and I'll tell you by whom, as the planning fallacy. And hopefully I will give you some inspiration and some insight into some techniques that can be used by individuals, but also by firms to combat the optimism bias, the planning fallacy, to be better at planning projects, planning and thinking about project objectives, and improve in general how accurate your forecasts of your goals of projects meets the reality. So that's in a nutshell. We're going to. Is there a question? I'm going to continue. Hopefully questions will come at the end. But that was the scope of what I'm going to be talking about today through several anecdotes and several stories about individual companies, but also more broadly summarizing it from an academic perspective, telling you about the literature and where it's at and what our investigation has yielded so far. So first, imagine you wake up in the morning and you look at a headline. This is a headline that I saw on the BBC in 2008, so this goes back a while. But back in 2008, they were already predicting a triple of the cost of building the London Aquatic Centre, the Olympic pool. And to be honest, we almost glossed over these headlines. Was I surprised to see that there was a triple unexpected cost from when London got the bid? No, I was not surprised at all. And why was I not surprised to see that? Because, if you go back historically, these types of budget creeps, specifically the domain of the Olympics, are pretty common. In Montreal, eventually the Olympics cost almost 12 times the original budget. We also hear about, creep in terms of the scope, or dissatisfaction in not meeting expectation in terms of the definition of the construction of these venues for the Olympics. In Athens, we were worried that the Olympics would never take place.
Followed by the pound.
In Salt Lake City, again, there was a creep of budget, 2.5 times the original budget. And again, the Olympics in Vancouver were also reported to exceed their costs. So what really is going on? Well, we almost think as it of second nature. We see a city hosting or bidding to host the Olympics. The city wins the Olympics, and we know that they will most likely exceed their budget. Many of their promises will not be met, and maybe, if we are lucky, they will actually be able to host the Olympics on time and meet the deadline. it's not only the Olympics that we know that are notorious for missing their originally stated goals, but if you think about many projects run by private companies, this phenomena exists there too. Companies routinely announce delays to their new product developments, launches get postponed, or products are being postponed and then recalled, launches take place on time, but then products are recalled because the specs were not met. And so everywhere we look, it seems like there is a lot of bad press associated with project delivery. Either projects are being reported to cost more than they were initially expected, projects do not fulfill their scope and the quality that they were promising, or they are just late in terms of meeting their deadlines. More broadly, and even if you think about individual projects that we plan, it seems pretty general to say that projects cost more, they take longer, and they deliver less than expected. The example on the slide that you're seeing right now is indeed the London Aquatic Center that was built for the Olympics, and it cost 3 times the anticipated cost. It was open and completed 2 years late, and it was the reality was that it was a third of the size that originally was promised. Psychologists tend to call this general phenomena the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate past completion times and costs. And again, the domains in which these psychologists have studied the phenomena are broad. It is true for individuals when they plan their personal projects, such as home renovation, Christmas shopping task, or planning their taxes for the upcoming year. And it is true for organizations when they invest many more resources in planning these projects, and yet still this phenomena exists. And the questions are several. First, why does this phenomena exist? Why is it so hard for us to plan? We all plan all the time on a regular basis at different levels. Why is this task so notoriously hard? And what can we do to address it? And let's start by talking about some reasons why the planning fallacy exists. And there are several. And broadly speaking, I can characterize them as cognitive biases or cognitive reasons that bring or introduce constraints on how good we will be in planning and forecasting. There are individual biases associated with every individual to a varying degree that might really impede our potential in terms of proper forecasting and proper planning. And then there will be a whole list of organizational and agency constraints that we might want to think of too. And over the years, these lists have been refined, and there has been some debate in the literature as to the real source of the planning fallacy. And today, most of us who work in this field have come to terms with the fact that it will be a mixture or a continuum of all these different factors that will ultimately determine the severity of the phenomena. But all of these will, at certain points in the planning stages, will emerge and will have an effect. And let me kind of give you a brief description of what they are before we move on to start thinking more broadly about remedies. So what kind of cognitive biases might impede our capability to plan? Well, confirmation, overconfidence, and anchoring biases. That is a whole group of biases that have to do with the way that we are wired. Daniel Kahneman, a very famous psychologist, calls these the system 1 reaction, or the immediate and intuitive reaction we have when we start planning and forecasting quantities. We usually anchor to the first numbers that we see. We are overconfident in the sense that we typically are more sure of ourselves and more sure of, or we're too narrow in the ranges of possible outcomes that we anticipate. And there's also a need to confirm. We want to see, or we look to see what we want to see, and so we always look for confirming evidence as opposed to contradictory evidence. And this is in our intuition. This is by gut and by definition the way that our brain is wired to think. And so it is hard for us to really assume that there are individuals that don't exhibit any of these. Optimism bias and the winner's curse are related in the sense that optimism bias is that we want to be optimistic. In fact, we might not necessarily even embark on a planning task if we weren't optimistic. So there might be something by nature, biological, ingrained idea that if we didn't have this tinted rosy glasses, we would have never even left the bed in the morning or even started a planning procedure. And so we by nature are optimistic, and we embark on activities hoping for the best. Out of sight and out of mind, again, if we are not reminded of how things can go wrong, we might just not think about them. Parkinson's law is that and this is a well-known and documented phenomenon in the context of project management. Again, time, if we are given time, we will eat it up. If we are given an allotted amount of time or budget to use towards a project, we will tend to use it to its fullest, and therefore we will always fall on the higher side of the curve and less likely to complete tasks early, perhaps on time, but much less likely to complete tasks early, and therefore there will be a knock-on effect, and ultimately things will get delayed and cost more than expected. If I look over to the right-hand side of the slide and I think about more agency constraints to do with agency issues, factors that have to do with the fact that we don't work in isolation, but that we, in typical planning situations, work together with either competitors or subcontractors, or we're bidding in order to win a bid. Then not always the nature of the interaction across companies and within companies might introduce a whole slew of effects that are more systematic, that might also lead to ultimately to the planning fallacy, meaning ultimately we will miss those set targets that we declared. The first is the Olympics effect, the idea that we want to be the city that hosts the Olympics. We want to win this bid, and therefore we will be extremely optimistic, and we will overpromise when we initially pitch the project, and therefore we are most likely going to disappoint in the aftermath once we've won the bid. A second reason that we might struggle to plan properly, it has to do with just the complexities of an organization, complexities of working with multiple departments, multiple functions across and within organizations. In the case of many of you, you talk about portfolio of projects and not necessarily single individual projects. The idea of failure to account for interdependencies across portfolios and dependencies between projects might be related to that bullet point, where not only are we underestimating or are we optimistic about the planning of a single individual project, but we fail to see how other coexisting projects might affect it. Student syndrome and planning to schedule has to do with the idea that once we set a target date, activities might get postponed until the last minute, and we will work towards the deadline and therefore be late because we are not expected to finish as soon as possible, or there is less of a drive and a focus on finishing as soon as possible, and therefore, again, it's in particularly associated with cost and duration, we are likely to overrun and overspend as opposed to coming either short or early with regards to our targets. And finally, competitor neglect. It's not only competitor neglect that I want to mention here, but there is a general idea that when we plan a project, we are so focused on the tasks and the activities that we as an organization and we as individuals have to take when we plan the project and when we execute the project that we don't think about the reaction of the market. We don't think about those, or we fail to always consciously consider what other players in the market are doing, how will our customers react, how will our competitors react, and that is likely to affect our expectations or the goals that we set in terms of revenues, in terms of deliverables. They sometimes disappoint and fail to meet expectations because we didn't account for the other players accurately. And most of these phenomena that I just described are phenomena that have been demonstrated in labs by psychologists or by controlled experiments, and they've also been demonstrated in organizations. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about some exploration that I've done to see indeed how wide a phenomena is the planning fallacy, which organizations exhibit it, have some organizations overcome it, and what can I learn from analyzing historical data about the characteristics of projects and organizations that really fall prey to the planning fallacy. And I know that the screen, the view of this letter is not perfect, but this is a publicly available document that you can find after this call on the web. And this is just to give you a setting. So I'm going to talk about the setting, a New York City setting. This is a report, an audit that came out of the comptroller, out of the office there. Once this is an annual thing that the New York City Department of Parks and Recs gets audited, and sadly this audit by John was not a positive one. And the audit found that the Departments of Recs and the Department of Parks and Recs in New York City did not carry out their capital construction projects in a timely and cost-effective manner. This report came out in 2013, and it specifically talks about the fiscal years of 2010 and 2011, but we see that 47% of the projects were not completed within their originally scheduled time frame, and the cost of about 10% of the projects exceeded their original contract and contingency amounts. This is not definitely not a positive audit report, but unfortunately it's also not rare. I don't want to single out the City of New York Department of Parks and Recs as the only organization that suffers from these types of reports, but it is one that allows us to study it because their projects are publicly available on the for us to explore. This data is data that we can actually take a closer look at. These are two examples of domains. One is indeed directly inspired by that letter or related to that letter. We started studying the data from the New York Departments of Parks and Recs. We looked at 1,800 projects and we considered how well they met expectations. And we also have data from the UK, from the United Kingdom, from the construction industry, and I will tell you a little bit about that later on in the call. So what did we find when we really took a deeper dive into the data from the New York Department of Parks and Recs? Well, we see that 50% over this 10-year span, 50% of the projects were over budget. On average, they were over budget by 48%. And 55% of them were delayed, or they were late compared to the original stated design. This figure is just another way to plot it and to take a closer look at the costs. But indeed, it confirms that in the New York City Departments of Parks and Recs, there is a strong planning fallacy. They do not meet their budgets. Nearly all their projects are over budget. And when we look even deeper and when we consider their data, and they have high quality data to enable us to explore this phenomena, we can also see that the phenomena is different over different types of projects. So electrical or trees or landscape projects, each type of or each subgroup of projects actually exhibits a slightly different pattern. And not all can be characterized in a similar way. For instance, the projects associated with planting trees, they actually take less than expected. They actually are completed early. Planting in general is completed early. Playgrounds, landscaping, electrical projects, those seem to take longer, and some exceed budgets by a greater amount. But there seems to be some categorization that we can do that allows us to anticipate different types of overruns, either from a budget perspective or from a duration perspective, even within the New York Parks and Recs. And so there are better ways to zoom in and to characterize exactly what is going on. And it's not that we need to perhaps apply, or when we talk about remedies, maybe we can be more specific in our prescriptions and we can target each one of these subcategories in a different way. In the UK data that I talked about, so in the construction data, we actually see a slightly different picture, a slightly better picture from a planning fallacy perspective, in the sense that it doesn't exist as much. The costs and the durations are met to a greater extent, and they exhibit much less planning fallacy than the New York Parks and Recs did. And so when we just look at these two data sets and we kind of try and summarize across these two data sets, it doesn't actually seem that the planning fallacy is always exists. While it might be a very common phenomena. Different organizations might have been able to cope with it differently, and the process of approving projects and approving portfolio of projects might have something to do with the way in which the planning fallacy will emerge. And again, I will talk about that or make some suggestions around that towards the end of my talk. What we do see across these data sets, or some of the conclusions that we are able to draw from a statistical perspective, is that the size of the project will, of course, affect the degree to which we will see planning fallacy. The type and the sector, the experience of the project team, how experienced the project team is, will of course directly be linked to the degree to which we see a exceeding budget or delays in the project delivery. The way the contractors were selected and the procurement systems, all of these have an effect ultimately on how well the actual projects will meet their originally stated goals, and they can already give us some kind of key or some kind of clue as to how we might want to start thinking of overcoming the planning fallacy. And so really what we're going to do is to talk about, okay, what can we do about it? What can we do about this phenomena of the planning fallacy? And is it just hopeless, or can we systematically find methods, techniques, systems, processes to put in place that can help us overcome it? And here's, again, an inspiration. The World Cup is now finished, and I think that it was fairly successful in terms of the facilities, although I know it was very hot there. But when they originally were planning and building the stadiums, the types of statements that we could read in the popular press was, it was almost natural that that work will remain to be done, or it was almost can be expected to be delayed, and there could be projects of this sort. It is expected that things will run late. And my question is, if it's so expected, and if we anticipate these overruns, well, let's plan for them from the get-go. And I'm not talking simply in terms of contingencies, but let's change the way that we plan projects and portfolio of projects, change the way we plan them, change the way that we approve them, and see if we can actually think about these ideas up front and include them in that process. And so in the context of the planning fallacy, the change comes from shifting from an inside view to an outside view. We want to change the way that we think about the planning process. Right now, every textbook that you pick up, or when people talk about planning projects, they typically describe what I would call, or what I would like everybody after the call to call, an inside view. What does an inside view mean? It means that when we plan a project, we think about the exact tasks that go into that project. We do a critical path analysis. We sit down and we build the work breakdown structure. We plan the dependencies. We really sit down and we describe the future project and everything to do with this unique endeavor that we're about to start in a lot of detail. How long will each task take? What are the resources? We talk very future-oriented about a new project that we're embarking on. That is the traditional way of planning projects. What we would like to advocate, or one way to think about overcoming the planning fallacy, is to practice more of an outside view. Outside view is everything but the new project that we're about to start. Think about historical patterns. Think about what it is that you've done in the past. How have we planned projects? How good are we at really meeting our deadlines? Forget the exact specifics of the project that we're about to start, but think about how well we forecasted in the past. Is the team that is planning a new project, do we have a track record? Have we historically been pretty good at meeting our goals? Have we just come out of a project that was a big failure, and what were the causes? So an outside view says, I am going to, the best of my ability, ignore the specifics of the new project that I am about to start, and I am going to look historically and statistically at my past performance. And this leads to a type of forecasting called reference class forecasting, and it usually is described by the following 5 steps. And if you're curious, or if you want to read up about any of the items that I'm talking about, I have some references at the end, and if you shoot me an email, I'm happy to even answer and expand on those references further. But what does a reference class forecasting procedure look like? Well, if you want to plan differently and follow the steps of the reference class forecasting, these are the 5 steps you need to take. First, select a reference class, a group of projects that are similar on the important characteristics to the project that you're about to start. Now, I'm assuming that some of you have some kind of curious or worried look on your face, and that might be because many of the companies on the phone are from new product development or from environments in which it's not always easy to think about a group of similar projects or projects with similar characteristics. In the sense that usually new products are unique. We would like to think of them as a one-time activity, and we're looking for constant innovation. All that is true, but I still maintain that there might be characteristics such as locations, size, or sheer scale of number of individuals that participate, the management team or the leadership team of the project, or even the domain and the clients that this new product will serve. Those are types of characteristics that might help us think about a reference class as a broader idea, and not necessarily, the characteristics don't have to be mapped one-to-one, but we can be pretty creative, and actually we should be creative in how we define our reference class. And so once we've defined and we've identified that there are groups that we will feel comfortable that are related to the new project that we're about to start, then we can start looking and tracking and seeking to determine the distribution of outcomes. For instance, if we're looking at cost, what is the distribution of costs associated with that reference class? What is the cumulative distribution look like? Or what does the histogram look like for all the costs associated with this reference class? Of course, the bigger the reference class, the more historical data you have, the more exact that distribution would be, or the richer picture it will describe. But you can do this fairly easily for costs, for durations, even revenues. If you're talking about the outcome that a project brings, you can think about what are the revenues that came from this reference class of projects. Once you have that distribution at hand and you know that you're talking about a whole range of outcomes, then you can start looking at the project that you're planning and say, where does it fall in the distribution? Meaning, where is it in terms of its slotting in that reference class? Is it on the high side of the reference class? Is it somewhere in the middle? Perhaps even work with the median or with the average, depending on how you feel about the outliers in the group, to pinpoint where your project at hand falls. And step 4 is really the key here, is to say, well, how reliable have I been in the past? Ideally, if you have the data, conduct the steps of 1 and 2, or conduct that distribution, not only for the outcomes and the actuals that occurred, but actually conduct the same exercise for the planned and the anticipated goals that you had. So take a group of reference class of projects, think about what you expected their cost to be, and then look at the distribution of their expected costs versus the distribution of their actual costs. Examine how reliable the team has been in assessing these outcomes in the past, and then adjust your current project estimate based on that reliability. So if you typically were 60% under, or if you exceeded your budget by a certain amount, shift your project and adjust it by that amount as is characterized by your reference class. Use that reliability from the historical data to determine where you want to position and where you think you will realistically position the current project at hand. Now, this is somewhat of a departure from how we currently plan, and so we might want to think about planning in the traditional way, using our critical path analysis or our more traditional tools, coming up with an estimates one way from an inside view, and then doing the outside view separately and examining the change or the delta between them, and using that as some kind of mechanism to adjust our expectations around a project. One domain or one case that I've been working with closely is in the UK. The process of defining a reference class for reference class forecasting and applying an outside view in order to overcome the optimism bias has been formalized in England. It has been formalized in the UK. There are formal Green Book guidelines by the Treasury to general how to come up with estimates or how to approve public projects. And the templates are very specific to each one of their groups or each one of the companies that work within that environment. And the UK Network Rail is one of those large bodies that works on large scope and large scale public projects. And so the UK Network Rail is one of the organizations that routinely actually tries to use this reference cost forecasting. They call it Optimism Uplift when they plan and when they start the process of approving their projects. And what we're working on as we speak, or my current involvement with this organization, is to come back and say, okay, we've been applying the Optimism Uplift for so many years. We do this in a specific way. I'm now revisiting and helping them think about whether or not it is actually helping them overcome the optimism bias, or whether it perhaps, and worryingly so, has introduced a whole new slew of problems. And so let me tell you a little bit about where this stands, and I will try and wrap it up with that and leave some time for questions. But a little bit about the UK Network Rail. So large organization, this is a declaration from their statements. They run, maintain, develop Britain's rail track signaling, bridges, tunnels, level crossings, and 17 key stations. They have over 3,000 projects a year. Most of them are infrastructure projects. There are other types of projects within. And as I said, this is a domain in where the Optimism Uplift has been applied for several years now, based on work that was done around 2000, and it was done from 2005 to 2008, looking at exactly the type of historical patterns that I described using the reference class forecasting approach. Recently, they've asked for a budget, or their most recent request for budget, for a 5-year budget, was 35 or just under 36 billion pounds. And what's interesting to note is that this number, 36 billion pounds, includes already a 60% contingency. 60% of that is to account for optimism bias. They don't actually have projects planned at that amount, but they are actually applying an uplift because they know that they will be, or historically they have shown to have been 60% exceed their planned budget. And so this is a huge inflation of their their needs. And what's worrying is that they might still exceed this budget that they've requested. So what we're doing is we're analyzing just under 1,600 projects of theirs that have lasted, just over 1,600 projects from the recent 10 years or so. And these projects have all requested revisions. So they have all come in. They've had some initial estimate, and they've all since been revised upwards to request additional budget. And all of these requests have been approved. And so what's interesting, and what might be here part of the organizational struggle, is that there are there aren't strong cases for shutting down a project, or projects are typically seen till the end and expected to be completed. And so revisions are usually approved fairly regularly. Interestingly, although the optimism bias is applied, and there is an uplift that is routinely applied, and the optimism bias is trying to be targeted directly, they still don't track accuracy and past performance. And perhaps of everything that I'm talking about, this bullet, the second to last bullet on this slide, is the most important one. No past accuracy or performance is reported. There is very little chance for an organization to overcome the planning fallacy or to improve their forecasting if they are not tracking their past accuracy. The New York Parks and Recs Department, the UK Construction, those organizations, and that data was rich because those organizations actually maintained a very careful accounting, and the databases existed to track what the original estimates were and what the actuals were without overriding those initial estimates. So the need is to change the culture, or focus on tracking, on monitoring, and on keeping some trace of accuracy in order to try and overcome any problem. what we're working with Network Rail is indeed on changing the process, on making sure that the uplifts that are applied are noted and documented, is that revisions aren't approved so readily, and that there is a need to isolate the body that does the planning and comes up with the estimates with the actual project managers that track the budget in reality. Again, we don't want a self-fulfilling prophecy in which we apply an uplift and then the budget is spent to its fullest. The uplift is there to protect us, and we are trying to overcome some tendency to run to target and above. We're also introducing ideas from wisdom of crowds, or aggregating over several individual experts beyond just assessing the estimates from a single individual. We want a whole team of experts to provide us their estimates for project goals. The wisdom of crowd idea is typically averaging forecasts. In this context, it's not as trivial. The average will not necessarily help us overcome the planning fallacy, and we need to use a combination of experts in a different way. And that is one area that I am exploring. What other statistical or what other aggregation tools can be used when we apply or when we collect expectations or we collect forecasts from multiple experts in a group? And of course, we are working with Network Rail closely to identify what are the characteristics, what are the attributes of the projects, as we did with New York's Parks and Recs. What are those specific attributes that will signal to us the largest degree of planning fallacy, or where are we most likely to see planning fallacy, and what types of projects, in what domains, in what regions of the country, by which teams, what type of experience, and any characteristics that we can find that again will allow us to focus on that subgroup of projects and find a different solution or identify a different uplift that needs to be applied, and perhaps even drill deeper and identify the causes that lead to these budgets or durations being exceeded, and solve them for each subgroup of projects based on these characteristics. I am going to pause there. I will hand back the control.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a lot of good questions for you, actually, on that coming from our participants. One that's really interesting is you mentioned the optimism uplift. And the question is, does Parkinson's law kind of come into play, and will Parkinson's law actually help, will cause people to fill up the contingency that you actually built in to the project plan?
Right, and yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's a great question, and I tried to address that towards the end. That's exactly what we are seeing now, indeed, in Network Rail. So it's not only about applying the uplift and adjusting. That will not solve the problem, because indeed there will still be the tendency to fill that budget. And so we need to really, one of the recommendations is to try and separate the two tasks. Try and separate the planning and the estimation from the execution. So have the estimates for the budgeting perspective and for the financials include the uplift, but in reality the targets that should be set in the field for the execution should be the targets stripped of the uplift. So we should identify a note that an uplift has been applied, and we should know that it should serve only for specific things. So it is more, in order to get an accurate representation of the finances and where we're headed, it should not be used as a practical operational guideline to guide the project manager throughout the execution of a project.
Got it. Okay, there's another question about whether your research has shown that optimism bias tends to vary by country. You've had a focus on UK, you've shown the United States, but if you look globally, are there any spikes that might occur in different regions in terms of optimism bias?
There are. My research hasn't shown a big difference. Many of the organizations that I tackle are either in the UK or the US, or they're more global companies, and so it will have to do with the culture in the organization globally and not necessarily by region. But what has been shown, if you look at the psychology literature, some of the biases, the cognitive biases that I mentioned, do vary by culture. So overconfidence is a notorious one. Some cultures actually social status is more linked with the how humble you are. In some cultures, the more confident you are, the more power you will known to have. And so it depends on the culture norms, and therefore individuals might tend to be more overconfident in their statements than in other cultures. And so especially where we look at the cognitive biases, there we will see a lot more impact on the region or on the culture versus on the organizational side. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think that was the spirit of the question. There's another question about beyond schedule and budget. Can optimism bias really pop up with respect to having overconfidence in past results or past revenue or past success for an innovation? Can it actually backfire?
Tell me more about that.
I'm paraphrasing the question, but I'm imagining it's the advice that you gave from looking at an outside view, where you're talking about look at the historical performance and how well you've done it in the past. Can that actually contribute to optimism bias by having overconfidence based on how well you've done in the past, and maybe that not really be applicable to something an innovation you're trying for the future?
So meaning if you were successful, will you be under the illusion that you will be successful in the future, and that you're not accounting for perhaps beginner's luck or something along those lines?
Yes, I'm paraphrasing that. The person who submitted that question, if I haven't characterized that in the right way, please feel free to chat with us to clarify.
Well, that's a great question, and I think there is a potential for it to backfire. And I think that a lot of this, the key is really in the reference class identification. And so, if you go ahead and you define as a reference class the projects that you were involved in and they were all successful, and suddenly everything looks optimistic, and you kind of use that to set your new targets, then maybe you are being a bit, or maybe it will backfire on you. But perhaps here you can run, in the classroom I would say, do a sensitivity analysis, okay? So experiment with the reference class in different perspectives. Define 2 types of reference class for each project. Look at it from different angles. Define a reference class based on a certain subset of characteristics internally, and then say, let's step out of our shell and say, across the entire industry, okay? So if I'm, for instance, a new product developer, if I'm in the game console industry, and I'm Sony, I can look at my historical portfolio of meetings, my PlayStation announcements and my PlayStation durations and performances, but I can also then aggregate what I do know about Nintendo, what I do know about Microsoft. I can group other companies outside, and I can actually try and change the way that I view my reference class to get an even richer picture of possible outcomes, and somewhere in that intersection will my target lie.
Got it. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Earlier, I think this is from earlier when you were talking about experience of the project team being a factor in planning fallacy. Does the experience of the project team apply to only experience with similar projects, or of just experience doing general project management well?
It was in that specific case, or over those data sets, it was more broadly just general experience. So it was not specific to the same types of projects. It was just years of experience, and indeed my intuition is going to say that there is something to be said to just general experience of a project manager, and running any sort of project that will kick in when they're embarking on a new project, regardless of how much experience they have in that domain. And so, and that is consistent with what we were finding.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, this is a fascinating topic, and there are still questions coming in. We definitely are going to provide a copy of this presentation. We'll send a recording of this webcast to all of you who registered. So don't worry, you'll get a chance to revisit this and also be able to follow up with more specific questions for Professor Yael Grushka-Cockayne. I wanted to just close out. For more information, and thank you, first of all, Professor, for sharing your research with us. This is very helpful for all of us on the phone. For more information on portfolio optimization, we have a lot more resources available for you. You'll see them on the screen there. Please feel free to check out innovation.decisionlens.com or capitalassets.decisionlens.com for white papers, videos, additional research and resources to help you in your portfolio planning. And we hope you found today's discussion valuable. We're at the top of the hour. We look forward to you joining our upcoming Risk Summit on August 13th, where we talk a little bit more about risk management in portfolio planning and project execution, and our next Innovator Spotlight, which will feature Seattle Public Utilities on August 21st. So keep an eye out for your invitations. Thank you again, Professor Yael Grushka-Cockayne.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Very valuable. Thanks a lot. Good day to all of you. We'll be sending the recording out very shortly. Thanks for joining us.